Welcome to Miss Scarlett. Subscribe and don't miss out on Patreon. Have fun! As the raindrops played their melody on the windowpane, Casey remained oblivious to the music outside, immersed in his solitary sanctuary. His haven, nestled among towers of books, exuded an aura of quiet determination. With a gentle rhythm, his fingers danced across the keyboard, guided by an unwavering focus. The warm glow from the screen bathed his intense gaze, highlighting his dedication even in the late hours. A thunderous intrusion startled him, disrupting his train of thought. He leaned back, his body craving respite. The hands of time on the wall clock pointed relentlessly towards the early hours, yet Casey's solitary existence knew no schedule. Frowning, he approached it cautiously.
"When did this arrive?"
he muttered, picking up the small, unmarked box. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, wrapped in plain brown paper. With a shrug, he tore it open. Inside lay a small, intricately carved stone figurine. It depicted a person with two faces, one male and one female, their features blending seamlessly in the middle. Casey's brow furrowed as he examined it, tracing the delicate lines with his finger. A jolt of electricity shot through his body the moment he touched it. The room spun, colors blurring into a kaleidoscope of chaos. Casey stumbled, his vision going dark as he felt himself falling. Sunlight streamed through unfamiliar curtains, rousing Casey from a deep slumber. He blinked, disoriented by the plush comfort of the bed beneath him. This wasn't his worn-out futon. As awareness crept in, panic followed. The room was all wrong. Spacious, tastefully decorated, with a view of a city skyline he didn't recognize. Casey sat up abruptly, and a cascade of long, blonde hair fell over his shoulders. No, not his shoulders. These were decidedly feminine shoulders, attached to a body that was most definitely not his own. "What the hell?" The voice that emerged was soft, melodious, and completely foreign. Heart racing, Casey scrambled out of bed, nearly tripping over unfamiliar legs. He caught sight of his reflection in a full-length mirror and froze, unable to process the image before him. Staring back was a woman in her early 30s, tall and slender with delicate features and piercing green eyes. She wore silk pajamas in a soft shade of blue, a stark contrast to Casey's usual ratty t-shirt and boxers. "This can't be happening," Casey whispered, watching the stranger's lips move in perfect sync with his words. He reached up to touch his face, her face, feeling the smooth skin beneath his fingertips. A phone buzzed on the nightstand, startling him. Casey picked it up hesitantly, seeing the name Rebecca flash across the screen.
"Hello?"
he answered, wincing at the unfamiliar voice. "Judith! Where are you? The meeting started 10 minutes ago!" The woman on the other end sounded exasperated. "Meeting?" Casey repeated dumbly. "The merger presentation? The one you've been preparing for weeks? Judith, are you feeling all right?" Casey's mind raced. Judith. That must be the name of the woman whose body he now inhabited.
I'm not feeling well,"
he managed to say.
"I think I need to take a sick day."
There was a pause on the other end. "You never take sick days," Rebecca said, concern evident in her voice. "Do you need me to come over?" "No," Casey said quickly. "No, I just need some rest. I'll call you later." He ended the call before Rebecca could respond, then sank onto the edge of the bed, head spinning. This had to be a dream. Some kind of vivid hallucination brought on by too much caffeine and too little sleep. But as the minutes ticked by and reality refused to shift, Casey was forced to confront the impossible truth. Somehow, he had switched bodies with this woman named Judith, the figurine. It had to be connected to this bizarre situation. Casey stood up, determined to find it, but quickly realized he had no idea where his own body, and the artifact, might be. A quick search of the apartment yielded no clues about Judith's life beyond the basics. She was clearly successful, judging by the upscale furnishings and designer clothes in the closet. A framed diploma on the wall indicated she had an MBA from a prestigious university. Casey found himself drawn to the walk-in closet, filled with an array of stylish clothes he couldn't even begin to comprehend. He pulled out a simple black dress, figuring it would be appropriate for whatever business meeting he'd apparently missed. Dressing proved to be a challenge. Casey fumbled with unfamiliar undergarments, his face burning with embarrassment as he struggled to fasten the bra. The dress, at least, was straightforward enough, though he felt utterly exposed in the knee-length garment. A quick rifling through Judith's purse revealed a wallet, keys, and a smartphone. Casey unlocked it, grateful there was no passcode, and began searching for any information that might help him understand what had happened. As he scrolled through emails and calendar appointments, a notification popped up. It was a news article about a string of mysterious incidents across the country, people claiming to have suddenly found themselves in different bodies. Casey's heart raced as he read the details. 3 other cases had been reported so far, all within the last 24 hours. Each person described a similar experience, touching an unusual artifact, then waking up in someone else's body. "I'm not alone," Casey murmured, a mix of relief and dread washing over him. He needed to find the others, to figure out how to reverse this before it became permanent. But first, he had to navigate Judith's life without raising suspicion. Casey took a deep breath, straightened the unfamiliar dress, and stepped out of the apartment into a world he barely recognized. The bustling city street was a far cry from Casey's quiet, isolated existence. He blinked in the bright sunlight, overwhelmed by the noise and activity surrounding him. People rushed by, engrossed in their phones or conversations, barely sparing him a glance. Casey consulted Judith's phone, looking for the address of her workplace. It was only a few blocks away, according to the map. He set off, trying to walk with confidence despite feeling completely out of his element. The click of heels on pavement was a constant reminder of his altered state. Casey marveled at how different everything looked from this new perspective. Not just the physical changes, but the way people interacted with him. Men held doors open, their gazes lingering a bit too long. Women offered small smiles of solidarity as they passed. As he approached the towering office building that housed Judith's company, Casey's stomach churned with anxiety. How was he supposed to fake his way through a high-powered business meeting when he could barely manage small talk? The security guard in the lobby greeted him with a nod.
"Good morning, Miss Calloway. Feeling better?"
Casey managed a weak smile. "Much, thank you." He hurried to the elevator, relieved to have made it past the first hurdle. The moment he stepped onto Judith's floor, a whirlwind in a crisp pantsuit descended upon him. "There you are!" It was Rebecca, the woman from the phone call. She thrust a tablet into Casey's hands. "I rescheduled the meeting for this afternoon. Are you sure you're up for this?" Casey nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He followed Rebecca into a sleek conference room, where several stern-faced executives were already seated. "Ms. Calloway, we were beginning to worry," one of them said. his tone conveying more irritation than concern. "I apologize for the delay," Casey said, channeling every ounce of confidence he could muster. "Shall we begin?" For the next hour, Casey fumbled his way through a presentation he barely understood, relying heavily on the notes Judith had prepared. He deflected questions he couldn't answer and made vague promises about following up on details later. By some miracle, he made it through without completely blowing Judith's career. As the executives filed out, murmuring among themselves, Rebecca pulled him aside. "What's going on with you?" she asked, her voice low. "You seem off." Casey forced a smile. "Just a bit under the weather. I'll be fine." Rebecca didn't look convinced, but she let it go. "All right. Don't forget about dinner with James tonight. He's been looking forward to it all week." Casey's heart sank. James. Was that Judith's boyfriend? Husband? He nodded weakly, adding another complication to his growing list of problems. As soon as he was alone, Casey slumped into Judith's office chair, exhausted. He needed to find a way to contact his own body, and fast. But how? A notification on Judith's phone caught his attention. It was an email from an unknown sender with the subject line, "We need to talk. Body swap." Casey's hands shook as he opened it. The message was brief. "If you're reading this, you're not alone. Meeting tonight, 8 p.m. at the Starlight Diner on 5th and Oak. Come alone. We'll figure this out together." Hope surged through Casey. This had to be from one of the other people affected by the body swap. He quickly typed out a response, confirming his attendance. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and paperwork. Casey did his best to keep up appearances, but he could tell people were noticing something was off. He overheard whispers about Judith acting strangely, about her seeming distracted and unsure of herself. As evening approached, Casey realized he had a decision to make. He could go to dinner with James, continuing the charade of being Judith, or he could meet the others at the diner and potentially find a way to fix this mess. In the end, it wasn't really a choice at all. He sent a text to James from Judith's phone, claiming a work emergency had come up. Then he hailed a taxi and gave the address for the Starlight Diner. The neon sign flickered as Casey approached the run-down establishment. He hesitated at the entrance, suddenly aware of how out of place Judith's designer outfit looked in this setting. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The diner was nearly empty, save for a group of 3 people huddled in a corner booth. They looked up as he entered, their eyes widening in recognition. Casey slid into the booth, taking in the mismatched group before him. There was an elderly man in a teenager's body, a middle-aged woman inhabiting what appeared to be a construction worker's physique, and a young man who carried himself with the grace of a much older woman.
"So,"
Casey said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I guess we're all in the same boat." The elderly man in the teen's body nodded grimly.
"Name's Frank. Or at least it was. Now I'm apparently Tyler, and I have to figure out how to use Snapchat."
The woman in the construction worker's body introduced herself next. "I'm Margaret. This is quite the change of pace from my usual book club meetings." The young man smiled wryly.
"Evelyn, I must say it's been ages since I've been able to touch my toes without groaning."
Casey couldn't help but laugh, the absurdity of the situation finally hitting him. "I'm Casey, though I suppose for now, I'm Judith." They spent the next hour sharing their stories, each one eerily similar. All had come into contact with strange artifacts, a ring, a brooch, a pendant, and woken up in new bodies far from home. But why us? Margaret asked, her new deep voice still startling her. What connects us? I think I might have an idea, Evelyn said. She pulled out a laptop, looking comically small in her large hands, and turned it to face the group. I've been doing some research. These artifacts, they're part of an ancient set, believed to have the power to transfer souls. Casey leaned in, studying the images on the screen. There was the figurine he had touched, along with several other objects that matched the descriptions given by the others. According to legend, Evelyn continued, the artifacts were created by a powerful sorcerer who sought to achieve immortality by switching bodies. But something went wrong, and instead of controlled transfers, the artifacts began swapping people at random.
So how do we switch back?
Frank demanded, his teenage voice cracking. Evelyn's expression grew serious. That's the problem. The legend says the transfers become permanent after 3 days. A heavy silence fell over the group as the implications sank in. Casey felt a wave of panic rising in his chest. 3 days? He had already lost one. There has to be a way, he said, forcing his voice to remain steady. We can't just stay like this forever. Margaret nodded in agreement. We need to find all the artifacts. Maybe if we bring them together, we can reverse the effects. But they could be anywhere, Frank pointed out. How are we supposed to track them down in just 2 days? Casey's mind raced, considering their options.
We'll have to split up,
he said finally.
Each of us takes a different lead. We stay in contact, share any information we find.
The others nodded, a sense of determination replacing the initial shock and fear. They exchanged contact information and agreed to meet again the following evening. As Casey left the diner, he felt a mix of hope and trepidation. They had a plan, however tenuous, but the clock was ticking. He hailed another taxi, giving the driver Judith's address. Back in the unfamiliar apartment, Casey paced restlessly. He needed to start searching for clues about the artifacts, but he also had to maintain Judith's life. One wrong move could raise suspicions and complicate their already precarious situation. A text message interrupted his thoughts. It was from James.
Everything okay? Missed you at dinner. Call me when you can.
Casey stared at the phone, torn. He couldn't ignore Judith's relationships entirely, but how could he possibly pretend to be her to someone who knew her intimately? With a sigh, he dialed James's number. A deep, warm voice answered on the second ring. Jude, I was getting worried. I'm sorry, Casey said, trying to infuse Judith's voice with the right amount of affection and contrition.
Work has been intense. I shouldn't have canceled on you.
There was a pause on the other end.
You don't sound like yourself. Are you sure everything's all right?
Casey's heart raced. I'm just tired, he said quickly.
Maybe coming down with something. I think I need a good night's sleep.
Do you want me to come over? I could bring some soup, take care of you. The genuine concern in James's voice made Casey's chest tighten with guilt. No, that's not necessary. I'll be fine. Let's have lunch tomorrow, okay? I'll make it up to you. After a few more reassurances, Casey ended the call, feeling like the worst kind of imposter. He collapsed onto the couch, overwhelmed by the complexity of the life he had stumbled into. But there was no time to dwell on it. He had research to do. Casey pulled out Judith's laptop and began searching for any information he could find on ancient artifacts with the power to transfer souls. Hours passed, as he fell down a rabbit hole of obscure mythology and fringe theories. His eyes burned from staring at the screen, but he pressed on, desperate for any lead that might help them. As dawn broke, casting a pale light through the windows, Casey finally found something promising. An article about a private collector who specialized in mystical artifacts, rumored to have recently acquired a set of items matching the description of what they were looking for. Excitement coursed through him as he sent a message to the others, sharing his discovery. They had a new lead to pursue, a potential path to reclaiming their own bodies. But as Casey caught sight of his reflection, Judith's reflection, in the window, a startling thought occurred to him. What if, when the time came, he didn't want to switch back? The idea shocked him. How could he even consider staying in this borrowed life? And yet, as he looked around at the successful, vibrant world Judith inhabited, he couldn't help but compare it to his own isolated existence. Casey pushed the thought aside, focusing on the task at hand. They had 2 days left to solve this, and he couldn't afford to be distracted by impossible choices. As he prepared for another day of pretending to be Judith, Casey wondered what she was experiencing in his body. Was she as lost and confused as he was? Or had she, perhaps, found something in his quiet life that appealed to her? With a shake of his head, Casey stepped out into the morning bustle of the city. Whatever happened, he was determined to see this through. One way or another, they would find a solution, and face whatever consequences came with it. The next 2 days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Casey juggled Judith's demanding work schedule with clandestine meetings and frantic research. He managed to keep James at bay with vague excuses about a big project, all while trying to track down the elusive collector who might hold the key to their salvation. It was Margaret who finally made the breakthrough. Using her construction worker body's connections, she managed to secure an invitation to an exclusive auction where the collector was rumored to be selling off part of his collection. "It's tonight," she told the group, her gruff voice tinged with excitement. "If the artifacts are there, we might have a chance to get them all in one place." The plan was risky. They would each attend the auction, posing as potential buyers. Evelyn, using her young male body's charm, would try to get close to the collector while the others bid on any items that matched the descriptions of the soul-swapping artifacts. As evening fell, Casey found himself staring at Judith's closet, trying to select an outfit appropriate for a high-end auction. He settled on a sleek black gown that hugged curves he was still not used to possessing. The reflection in the mirror was stunning, but it only served to remind Casey of how out of place he truly was. The auction house was a grand, imposing building in the heart of the city. Casey's heart raced as he handed Judith's invitation to the doorman, praying he wouldn't be turned away. To his relief, he was ushered inside without incident. The room was filled with the city's elite, sipping champagne and eyeing the items on display with barely concealed greed. Casey scanned the crowd, quickly spotting his fellow body swappers. They exchanged subtle nods of acknowledgement before splitting up to cover more ground. As the auction began, Casey's palms grew sweaty. He clutched Judith's paddle, waiting for any sign of the artifacts they sought. Lot after lot went by, antique furniture and rare paintings fetching astronomical sums. And then, there it was, a set of mystical curiosities, including a figurine that looked identical to the one Casey had touched. His hand shot up, paddle raised high. 5,000! He called out, voice steady despite his internal panic. The bidding war that ensued was fierce. Casey found himself locked in a battle with a severe-looking woman in the front row. Each bid pushing the price higher and higher. He was acutely aware that he was spending Judith's money, but there was no other choice. "Sold!" The auctioneer's gavel came down with a resounding thud. "To the lady in black for $75,000. Casey let out a shaky breath, both elated and terrified. He had secured the artifacts, but at what cost? As he made his way to claim his prize, he caught sight of Evelyn engaged in animated conversation with an older gentleman, presumably the collector. Frank and Margaret converged on his location, their expressions a mix of hope and anxiety.
"Did you get them?"
Frank whispered, his teenage voice cracking with excitement. Casey nodded, clutching the ornate box that held their potential salvation.
"All of them, I think. But now what?"
Before anyone could respond, a commotion broke out near the entrance. Casey's blood ran cold as he recognized the figure pushing through the crowd. It was his own body, inhabited by Judith herself. Their eyes met across the room, a moment of shocked recognition passing between them. Casey saw his own face contort with a mix of anger and desperation. "Stop her!" Judith shouted, pointing directly at Casey. "She's an imposter!" Chaos erupted in the auction house. Security guards moved to intercept Casey, while confused guests murmured and pointed. In the confusion, he felt a hand grab his arm. "This way!" Margaret hissed, pulling him towards a side exit. "We need to get out of here, now." The group fled into the night, the sound of pursuit not far behind. They piled into Margaret's borrowed pickup truck, the incongruity of her bulky frame behind the wheel almost comical in the tense moment. As they sped away from the auction house, Casey clutched the box of artifacts to his chest. They had what they came for, but at what cost? And with less than 24 hours left before the switch became permanent, would it be enough? The truck screeched to a halt in front of an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was a far cry from the luxurious auction house they had just fled, but it would have to do.
"We need to figure this out fast,"
Frank said, pacing back and forth. His teenage body thrummed with nervous energy.
"That Judith woman is going to have the cops after us in no time."
Casey set the box down on a dusty crate, his hands shaking slightly as he opened it. Inside lay the figurine he had first touched, along with several other objects. A ring, a brooch, and a small ornate mirror.
"These have to be it,"
he said, looking up at the others.
"But how do we use them to switch back?"
Evelyn stepped forward, her young male face creased with concentration. "The legend I found mentioned something about a ritual. All the artifacts need to be together, and those who've been swapped must each touch the object that originally caused their transfer." Margaret nodded, her construction worker's frame looming over the box. "Makes sense. But what about the timing? We're cutting it awfully close to that 3-day deadline." As if on cue, a distant siren wailed, growing steadily closer. The group exchanged panicked glances. "We don't have a choice," Casey said, steeling himself. "We have to try it now." They quickly arranged the artifacts in a circle on the floor. Each person stood before the object that had caused their initial swap. Casey's heart pounded as he reached out towards the figurine, acutely aware of Judith's delicate hand hovering inches from the carved stone.
"On 3.
Frank said, his voice steadier than it had been all night.
1, 2.
The warehouse door burst open with a crash. Judith stood in the entrance, flanked by several police officers. Her eyes, Casey's eyes, widened as she took in the scene before her. 3! Casey shouted. Their hands came down on the artifacts simultaneously. A blinding light filled the warehouse, accompanied by a deafening roar. Casey felt as though he was being torn apart and reassembled, every atom of his being scattered to the wind and then pulled back together. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Casey blinked, disoriented. He was on the floor, his head spinning. But as he pushed himself up, he realized with a jolt of relief that the hands bracing against the concrete were his own. He was back in his body. Around him, the others were also stirring, each looking relieved and bewildered in equal measure. Frank, once again in his elderly form, chuckled weakly.
Well, I'll be damned. It worked.
But their relief was short-lived. The police officers, momentarily stunned by the display, were now advancing cautiously, hands on their weapons. "Freeze!" one of them shouted. "Nobody move!" Casey raised his hands slowly, mind racing. How could they possibly explain what had just happened? To his surprise, it was Judith who spoke up. She stepped forward, her composure regained now that she was back in her own body. "Officers, there's been a misunderstanding. These people are not criminals. They're participants in an elaborate reality show." The police looked skeptical, but Judith pressed on, her voice smooth and convincing. "I'm a producer for the show. We were testing a new concept involving identity swapping. Things got a bit out of hand, and I apologize for the confusion. If you'd like, I can have our legal team contact your superiors to clear this up." Casey held his breath, hardly daring to believe Judith's quick thinking might save them. After what felt like an eternity, the lead officer lowered his weapon. "We'll need to verify this story, ma'am. I suggest you all come down to the station to sort this out." As they were led out of the warehouse, Casey caught Judith's eye. She gave him a small, conspiratorial smile. In that moment, he realized that their shared experience, however brief, had forged a connection between them that neither had anticipated. The next few hours were a blur of questioning and explanations. Judith's influence and quick wit managed to smooth things over with the authorities, though Casey suspected they would be keeping a close eye on the group for some time. As dawn broke, they found themselves sitting in a 24-hour diner, nursing cups of coffee and trying to process everything that had happened. The artifacts had vanished in the chaos, perhaps returning to wherever they had come from originally. "So," Margaret said, breaking the silence. "What now?" They looked at each other, a shared understanding passing between them. Their lives had been irrevocably changed by this experience. They couldn't simply go back to who they were before. Casey cleared his throat. I think we've been given a second chance. A chance to see our lives from a different perspective." Judith nodded, surprising them all. "Casey's right. I never realized how empty my life had become until I stepped into his. All the success, the money, it meant nothing without real connection. And I never appreciated the value of slowing down," Frank added. "Being young again was exciting, but exhausting. I think I'll enjoy my retirement a bit more now." One by one, they shared what they had learned, the insights gained from walking in someone else's shoes. As they talked, plans began to form. Margaret decided to volunteer at a youth center, sharing her life experiences with a new generation. Evelyn, inspired by her time in a younger body, committed to taking better care of her health. And Casey? He found himself exchanging numbers with Judith, a tentative friendship forming between the unlikely pair. She offered to help him break out of his shell, to experience more of what life had to offer. In return, he promised to remind her of the value of quiet moments and self-reflection. As they parted ways, each heading back to lives that would never be quite the same, Casey felt a sense of excitement he hadn't experienced in years. The world seemed full of possibilities now, waiting to be explored. He stepped out onto the street, inhaling deeply. The city was waking up, the first rays of sunlight painting the buildings in warm hues. For the first time in a long while, Casey felt truly alive. The body swap had been terrifying, confusing, and at times, utterly absurd. But as he walked home, Casey realized it had also been exactly what he needed. A wake-up call, a push out of his comfort zone, and a reminder that life was meant to be lived, not merely observed. With a smile, he set off towards his apartment, ready to start writing the next chapter of his story, one that would be entirely his own.
Thanks for watching, my girlies! Be sure to check out Patreon for more!